Before we do that, what I'd like to do today is give you kind of an overview of this book. Why it's important, who wrote it, what the format of the book is, and what its major themes and symbols are. Because if you know this stuff, it'll be much easier to understand what's going on and why the characters are saying what they're saying in the first place. So what I hope to do in this unit is read through this work together, discuss it, analyze it, get y'all's opinions on the arguments, and hopefully engage our critical thinking skills so we can get something out of this highly influential, profound work of philosophy. So most of the class today is going to be me providing you an overview, and then later, near the end of the class, we'll actually start reading it. And we're going to take our time. It'll depend on what y'all want to do. If we want to hop from book to book or chapter to chapter in today's language. But we're just going to start with the first one, obviously. Because in an important and fundamental way, this first book or this first chapter really sets the stage. And it is in this first chapter that we see all of the major themes and symbols appearing. So let's get into it. So the first work we're going to be reading and critically analyzing is Plato's Republic. It's impossible for me to give you a comprehensive overview of this work and how profound it is, but it has deeply influenced not only Western philosophy, but just Western thought in general. There's a picture of Plato. He's the guy who wrote this. Plato is a historical figure, an ancient Greek philosopher who's long dead, who was a student of Socrates. And we can kind of understand this book as being written for a variety of reasons. One thing that you will want to know is that although the book is split up into what's called Book 1, Book 2, Book 3, these are what we would call chapters in today's language. They were originally written on scrolls, which is why they're separated the way that they're separated. Not only is this work concerned with some of the fundamental problems of human existence, but it is an arduous work of passion on behalf of Plato, who actually ended up starting his own philosophy school called the Academy in Athens, Greece, during the time of the ancient Greeks and Romans. Sure, yeah. Let me know if this is better. Is that helping a little bit? Yeah. Oh, okay. Oh, it was shining in your eyes. I get it. Okay. So that's why the book is separated the way that it is because it was written on several different scrolls of parchment. Now, the format of this book is really important. Yes?
Was the school just straight up called the Academy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep. And there were a few different philosophy schools that popped up around this time, but the Academy was probably the most influential and important. The format of this book is that it's a dialogue between different characters. So that's the first thing that you need to know about it. It's kind of impossible for me to overstate how much symbolism there is in this book, how deep the philosophy goes, how many different layers there are to it. But I think it would be good for you all to know that the characters themselves are supposed to resemble different types of government, or what we might call socio-political organization. This book, The Republic, is trying to answer a few really fundamental questions, such as what is justice? What is the ideal form of government? What does the ideal society look like? What is the good in life, and how do we achieve it? How do we live a fulfilling and happy life? And to kind of explore all these philosophical themes, what Plato ended up doing is he ended up using the different characters in this dialogue to represent different kinds of government that he's going to be discussing. So Socrates, who is our protagonist in the dialogue, Plato's mentor, who never actually wrote anything himself, is represented as an aristocrat. Somebody who comes from a knowledgeable or influential social place. And he's supposed to represent the form of government that's known as an aristocracy. Ruled by the few knowledgeable, important people who make all the decisions in society. The other characters in the book also represent different forms of socio-political organization. Glaucon, who is Socrates' companion, is supposed to represent timocracy. Does anybody know what a timocracy is? This isn't a form of government that we talk a lot about nowadays. A timocracy is a form of government in which the property owners kind of decide how society is run and how it goes. So Glaucon is supposed to represent that form of government. And as we'll see in the character's speech, in the character's mannerisms, in their behaviors, their individual characters are also symbolic of these different forms of government and what these different forms of government have on humans. So Plato thinks that there are better and worse forms of government. Aristocracy is the best. Then it goes timocracy. Then it goes oligarchy, which is rule by the people who have money, who have wealth in society. Democracy, according to Plato, is the second worst form of government that he's looking at in this work for a number of reasons. And then the worst form of government that he critiques is a tyranny, ruled by a tyrannical dictator, one person who has all the say in how society is run and what the rules and laws are. Yeah.
So what was Plato?
Plato would be an aristocrat, or he would be formed before an aristocracy. As we'll see, Plato thinks that the smart people should be in charge, the wise and knowledgeable and good people who don't have a lust for power. And so he privileges a form of government that we might call an epistemic aristocracy, where epistemic is meant to reference knowledge, ruled by the smart and knowledgeable people. He would call these aristocrats later in this book Philosopher Kings, that ideally Greek society should be run by Philosopher Kings. But not just men. He uses the term Philosopher Kings, but he means women also can be the rulers. And in some ways, as we'll see, Plato is actually kind of very progressive in his thought compared to his day and age, which was extremely patriarchal and in some ways authoritarian. In any case, Socrates is supposed to represent in this work the aristocracy, why that form of government is best. Glaucon represents a timocracy. Adeimantus represents an oligarchy ruled by the wealthy. Polemarchus represents a democracy. And Thrasymachus represents rule by the tyrant. So try to keep these in mind as we read, because what the characters are saying, what they're doing in the dialogue, the different actions they take, are supposed to be representative of what Plato thinks the kinds of people these societies would produce, and the kinds of individual characters that these societies would engender in the populace. Now, as I said before, we can kind of understand the Republic as written for a variety of reasons. One of the reasons why Plato is writing this work is because he's seeking to overturn kind of the traditional Greek religion, morality, and law of his day. This is a large work. It's a very complex work filled with a lot of different layers of symbolism. And so it contains philosophy, it contains political theory, lots of different rhetorical and literary devices, different narratives and stories, and eventually, as we'll see, different mythologies. Because Plato is going to end up saying that although society should be ruled by the smart people, not everybody has the capability to be a philosopher king, and it might be necessary to instill in the people a kind of mythology about where it is, why they are where they are in this class society, and why they should do the job that they're doing. So it's a very deep work. It's touching on a lot of different topics and a lot of fundamental questions that we ask ourselves as we go through life. I want y'all to take a particular attitude towards this work. Not very many books, maybe not any books, have been written with the care that the Republic was written. I want you to assume that every example that is chosen in this book by Plato, every word, every sentence, every symbol was chosen intentionally for a specific purpose. This work contains a lot of layers, as I said before, and so I want you to presume that Plato knows what he's talking about. I want you to presume that Plato has been thinking about these issues for a long time. And I want you to presume from the outset that every symbol, example, word, sentence has been carefully chosen by Plato to have a particular effect on the reader. Okay? So we kind of have this attitude nowadays that, oh, we know a lot more than those ancient Greeks and Romans did, and we see the world more accurately, and everything that they said can be kind of thrown out because it's not very useful. I want you to take that attitude and toss it in the trash bin. Okay? Because as we'll see, although the writing style is different from what we're normally used to reading, there are a lot of good reasons for why Plato is saying what he's saying in this work. And a lot of good reasons for why he's choosing the examples that he's doing and offering the philosophy that he's offering. So assume that this work was written with a great deal of care and a great deal of wisdom. Give Plato some charity when you read it. Okay? Don't just immediately assume that because he was born a long time ago and they had a different view of the world, that everything he thinks is ass backwards. Okay? Don't assume that. Instead, I like Leo Strauss's strategy when reading philosophy. We should err on the side of giving Plato or giving anybody that we read too much. We should err on the side of not taking anything for granted. Okay? Not assuming that we know better than the person that we're reading. So try to cultivate that attitude as you read this work. It would be very helpful for you to also understand some of the historical context surrounding this book, because this will help explain to you why it was written and why it's touching on the themes that it is. Okay? During this time, the time that Plato ended up writing the Republic, it was a period in ancient Greek history in which Athens, the Greek city-state, had just lost the Peloponnesian War to Sparta. If y'all have ever played any video games such as, Assassin's Creed Odyssey, they deal with this time period. This time period of the Peloponnesian War, which was a conflict between the Athenians and the other Greek city-states and the Spartans. So we should understand this work as written in part as a response to the Athenians losing this war to the Spartans. And we should also understand this work as kind of Plato's critique of democracy. Democracy originated in ancient Greece. During this time, they had a democratic form of government where basically all men were expected to enter political life. And really, all political members had a say in the kinds of laws and norms and standards by which society was run. Plato thinks that this ended up really bad for the Athenians. Okay? Plato doesn't have a very high view of democracy because he sees the Athenians' loss in the Peloponnesian War as being a direct result of the failure of this democratic form of government. Let me ask you all this. We kind of have something like a democracy in the U.S. If you want to get more technical, we have what's called a democratic republic, where we elect representatives who then make laws and decisions on our behalf. But those representatives are elected democratically for the most part. Do you think that the average American inhabitant really understands what's going on in the country? Seeing a lot of shaking of heads. Do you think the average person who's voting is that intelligent? It doesn't matter which side of the political aisle you fall down on, right? You think probably half the country is a bunch of idiots. Right? Plato is no different. He's like, look, we have all these people who are having a say in how society is run. But not only do they not have noble characters, they're not virtuous, they're not moral and loving and just people, but they're stupid. And only somebody who's an idiot would let a bunch of stupid people decide how society is run. Okay? So Plato thinks that this terrible loss that they just received in war, and the fact that now the Spartans are ruling over them, is a direct result of democracy, which is kind of inevitably a form of government that is going to fail and, at worst, devolve into a tyranny, a dictatorship. And so one reason why Plato is writing this is because he sees what's happening in Athens, he doesn't think it's good, and he thinks the whole reason we got into this war and the whole reason we lost it is because a bunch of stupid people are making the decisions. And that's not good. Okay? Another reason why he's writing this book has to do with some other social currents that were going on during this time. There was a rise in popularity and influence of a group of people called the Sophists, or the Sophists. Have you all ever heard the phrase sophistry? The word sophistry? Does anybody know what it means? To engage in sophistry? Yeah.
Is it skepticism?
Partly skepticism. There's a skeptical component to it. If somebody is engaged in sophistry, we think that they're just playing around with words. They're using a lot of rhetoric. They're not really trying to get to the truth, but they're trying to get one over on you. Okay? During this time, this group called the Sophists was emerging, a group which saw their opportunity to make money and gain political power by teaching other young men that were going to enter the political sphere rhetoric. Teaching other young men how to get one up on their political opponents by playing around with words, by using different rhetorical debate tactics, by not seeking after the truth, but who privileged instead gaining political power and wealth. And Plato thought that this was a terrible thing. This was a corrupting influence in Athenian society, okay? This group of sophists that was emerging, that was not teaching young men how to think, how to critically engage with arguments, but how to use rhetoric to persuade people, how to manipulate people. And their aims were not pure either. They weren't doing this to make society better. They weren't doing this to make themselves better people. They were doing this to gain money and political power for themselves, and perhaps to cultivate political allies. So throughout this whole book, and through this time generally in ancient Greek philosophy, what we see is this kind of battle between the philosophers and the sophists. Philosophers are supposed to be concerned with the truth, figuring out what the truth is, figuring out what justice is and what the good is, building each other up and making each other more knowledgeable. Philosophers famously never asked for money for their services. They were just the people hanging out who would have conversations with others. give logical arguments for things, try to steer people towards the truth. Whereas the Sophists weren't so concerned with truth. They would charge people for their services, and sometimes their services were not very good and were themselves corrupting the moral characters of people, encouraging people to get into politics, not for good reasons, not for the good of the community, but for personal selfish reasons. Okay? So part of this whole book is also trying to evince Plato's criticisms of the Sophists, of sophistry, and how this new group of people was corrupting and influencing Greek society in a bad way. Finally, as I noted before, we also generally think that Plato wrote this work as a very revolutionary act. He wasn't trying to completely overturn Greek society, but he thought that Greek society, because it had been raised on the poetry of Homer, was prioritizing the wrong ideals and the wrong moral values. Okay? The kinds of characters and actions that we see being praised and prized in Homer's Odyssey are things like physical prowess, protection of private interests, like one's personal family, friends, and property, Homeric ideals, privilege, violent heroism, achieving glory in battle by killing others and displaying physical prowess, bless you, and in general, self-gratification. Plato thought that these values were corrupting the Greek people. Okay? In some sense, Homer gets some things right in saying that physical prowess is good and protecting others is good. But these values and moral standards are not the values and moral standards that Plato thought the Greeks should be relying on and using to inform their behavior and their norms in society. Okay? In contrast to physical prowess, Plato is going to be advocating for training and bettering your mind. It's good to be fit, but being the biggest, strongest hunk at the gym should not be prioritized over becoming smart and wise. Becoming smart and wise should be the thing that you're primarily seeking after. Plato also thought that merely trying to protect one's own interests is not a good way for society to be run. As we may see later in this work, Plato advocates for a kind of, well, you might say communistic form of social organization, at least for the classes that are lower than the Philosopher Kings, although the Philosopher Kings are concerned with the collective as well. Plato saw in some sense even the existence of the family unit as something that should be questioned and perhaps done away with. Later in the Republic, he talks about how in an ideal society there wouldn't be any families. Instead, the whole society would raise the children together communally, that people wouldn't have husbands and wives. They would have sexual partners, perhaps, when it was time to have children. But everybody would see each other as their own brothers and sisters. And so there's a very communal, collectivist aspect to this. And Plato also thinks that we should do away with private property. And instead that society, all the members of society together, collectively own the products of society and the property of society. Plato's going to say, look, violent, heroic actions in battle are necessary and good sometimes when you're fighting off your enemies, but you shouldn't go out looking for fights. You shouldn't try to just start wars for the sake of achieving a glorious death on the battlefield. Okay, that's dumb, Plato would say. And finally, we should not seek to gratify ourselves and achieve merely our own interests. We need to take a more collectivist, communal view towards others in our society. Looking out for our fellow person, showing love to every member of society, treating all of the children as our own children, and everybody else that is our age as our own brothers and sisters, rather than dividing ourselves up into these small private family units whose interests may conflict with other families. Okay? So I think these are some of the big reasons why Plato is writing this work. He's critiquing Athenian democracy. He's trying to expose the sophists and argue in favor of philosophy instead of sophistry. And in a sense, he's trying to overturn some of the basic values and ideals and behaviors that the Greeks are currently living and acting out. Because he thinks that these values and ideals and behaviors is in part what got them into this mess in the Peloponnesian War in the first place. So far, so good? Okay. Primarily, we can understand the Republic as a book about justice, consciousness. Plato's going to use the word soul here, but he doesn't mean something like a Christian immortal soul that is distinct from your body. When he uses the term soul, he means like your mind or your consciousness. So it's a book about social political theory, justice, the soul, and figuring out what the good life is. What does the happy, fulfilling life look like, and how do we get there? And how do we cultivate a society that helps others achieve that, and that instills the proper values in members of society? Again, what Plato is trying to do here, even though he doesn't explicitly come out and say it, is he's really trying to overturn traditional Homeric Greek morality, religion, politics, and get people to actually think about whether or not all aspects of the old traditions are worth preserving. So this work is meant to question, to overturn, and to get people to actually critically reflect on where they are at in life, how they can make their lives better, how they can make society better, and how they can become more wise, just, knowledgeable individuals. Any questions? Okay.
Can you go back for just a second? I'm sorry.
Sure.
Sorry.
And I'll put this up on Canvas, obviously, the PowerPoint. So you can study it and internalize these ideas on your own time. Now, Plato's going to be doing a lot of this kind of without explicitly saying that he's doing it, right? Because this work is formatted as a dialogue between different characters having various conversations. So he's not going to come out and say a lot of this stuff, but this is what's going on behind the scenes, between the lines. Okay? So look for these things as you read the work. It would be helpful also for you to know some of the major themes and symbols that occur in this book before you start reading it. Because if you don't know this stuff, you're just going to be lost. You're not going to understand what the characters are saying, why they're saying what they're saying, and why any of it matters, or what Plato is trying to do with this text. Okay? One theme that we see throughout this book is Plato trying to advocate for prioritizing reality over appearance. And this has to do with the sophists at the time. It has to do with how society is being run during the time in which Plato is writing this. Plato is going to say things like, the sophists, they're not interested in really uncovering what reality is actually fundamentally like. They're interested in dishing out appearances to people in a rhetorical fashion so that they can one-up their political opponents. And that really, how we understand the way reality works and therefore how it is that we should organize ourselves and what we should be doing in our lives, requires to depend on knowledge of the universe, of how reality actually operates. And the only way to get to that is through philosophy. And by philosophy, he means love of wisdom or love of knowledge. We need to cultivate a knowledge of the world, not just engaging in mere appearances. He would liken poetry to appearances, because poetry isn't based on historical events. It's a story that the poet is putting in front of you. Images, appearances of things, but not actually getting to the fundamental essence of what reality is. Because Plato is a philosopher, and he's interested in providing knowledge to people, understanding how the world works, and providing logical arguments for his positions. Another major theme that we see is the privileging of inquiry over mere acceptance. For too long, Plato reckons, the Greek people have merely accepted the values and the systems of morality and the old traditions without actually reflecting on them. Without actually thinking, are these still good for us? Are these going to help us get where we want to go? And you all kindly already privilege inquiry over mere acceptance, don't you? Sure, you've been conditioned to have a particular worldview, but you've come to realize that, everything your parents taught you, everything that your teachers taught you, it's not all right, right? It's good to question the things that you've been taught, the things that you've learned in your education. It's good to question your positions and your beliefs, not just rest easy in what other people tell you, right? Because then otherwise, how do you know you actually have an accurate picture of reality unless you think things through, unless you question it? So we see Plato engaging in this as well. And we also see him privileging knowledge over political power and status. One of the main themes of the Republic is that the reason why the Athenians are in the mess that they're in is because people have been privileging power, political power, and social status for too long, rather than privileging an accurate understanding of reality. Okay? And not only that, but there's a tenuous relationship between the seekers of knowledge, the philosophers, and the other political members of society. Does anybody know what happened to Plato's mentor, Socrates?
He was executed.
He was executed. Do you know why? Or what he was accused of?
Not particularly.
Wasn't it because he was too smart? Not too smart, but he went against the values that were happening. I just know it was because he was too smart, or he had too much of a big mouth. No one wanted to hear what he had to say. No, just shut up. You can't say that. Something along those lines from what I
It's along those lines, yeah.
Did he challenge their idea on space, social stuff?
Yeah.
Or something like that?
Yeah, Socrates basically challenged everybody's ideas. Okay? He challenged whether or not the politicians actually knew what they were talking about. Whether or not the people who claim to know what justice are, what the ideal form of society is, whether or not they have any good arguments for that stuff. And for his big mouth, for getting people to question these things, the foundations on which Greek society was built, the old traditions, the old ways, Socrates was executed. He was forced to drink hemlock, which he gladly accepted after saying he kind of owed the state for all of that the state had given him during his life, but that's a separate thing. One of the things that Plato is doing in this work is he's trying to draw out why the tenuous relationship between the philosophers and the politicians is there, and why that's bad. Okay? The politicians of this time don't want people questioning the social order. All right? They don't want people questioning the values and the ideals of Greek society. Why? Well, because then they can lose their power and lose their wealth and lose their hold over the people. Right? These politicians, as Plato sees them, and these sophists, they're in it for themselves. They're trying to safeguard their own interests and their own wealth and say they don't like when people talk back. And so, Socrates ultimately was executed for the crime of, quote, corrupting the youth, turning the youth against the elders in society who are in political positions of power and authority. And of course, they didn't like that, right? So part of this book is trying to explain and show what kind of tensions there are between the philosophers and the other members of the community. Because the lay people who don't do philosophy and the politicians who are in it for themselves, they don't have a rosy view of philosophers, and they'd rather kind of push them out of the social sphere. Plato is in some sense trying to repair the relationship between the people and the philosophers, because the philosophers have been given a bad name, because they've apparently threatened the interests of the elite who don't want to give up their power and wealth. Of course, throughout this whole text, we're going to see Plato privileging logic and reason over emotionality and feeling. Plato uses the image of a city in order to explain how somebody should order their individual life, what kind of habits they should develop, what kind of ideals and priorities they should have. Plato believes in a hierarchical society. The ideal society, according to him, is a three-class society with Philosopher Kings at the top, then the spirited, lively poet guardians in the middle, who are the army and the policemen, and then the tradespeople and the producers and the craftsmen on the bottom. And likewise, he's also going to say, if you want to live a good and happy life, your life has to be organized in a certain hierarchical fashion, with logic and reason at the top. Logic and reason should be the thing that presides over your emotions and your desires and your instincts. Okay? Because if you let your emotions and your desires and your instincts control you, not only are you not going to be able to cultivate a good, fulfilling life for yourself, but you're going to harm others. If you're just pulled this way and that by your desires for sex and drink, for drugs and orgies, okay? That's not going to work out good for you, and that's not going to work out good for the people. So, he's going to say logic and reason needs to be at the top. Desire and emotionality is not inherently bad. They have their place, but they must be in submission to your logical and critical thinking skills. And your body and mind must be ordered in a properly hierarchical fashion with logic and reason at the top if we're going to make society better and if we're going to make our individual lives happier and better. We're also going to be seeing Plato privileging what's called dialectic over rhetoric. So how did we define rhetoric? Who remembers? What is rhetoric? Somebody look back at their notes. Yeah, okay.
Rhetoric is like a way of like how to manipulate people and use the argumentation to manipulate people.
Yeah, manipulate might be a strong word. Some rhetorical techniques are manipulative. Yeah.
It is the art or study of persuasion in speech or writing to persuade people to actually think a certain way.
Right. So we define rhetoric as the art or study of persuasion in speech and writing. What Plato was seeing during his day, due to a lot of politicians and a lot of sophists, is that they're being trained in rhetoric that is manipulative, and they're not being trained in rational argumentation, which is dialectic, he would say. What it means for something to be dialectic is that there's a back and forth. There's a conversation happening. A pushing and a pulling, a giving and a taking. When dialectic occurs, people are trying to figure out what the truth is. They're trying to get to the bottom of something. They're trying to come to a better understanding of reality. Not just coming to a better understanding of how to manipulate people. Okay? So the whole book is set up as a dialectic between these different characters. A conversation between these different characters who are trying to figure out what the truth is on all of these questions. Plato doesn't think that rhetoric is all that great. Rhetoric can be used for bad purposes. And that what we should be appealing to is people's logic and reasoning capacities. And that's what we should be utilizing when we talk to others and running societies and running our own lives. Not trying to manipulate ourselves or others for personal gain. Okay? Another major theme is Plato's conception of justice, or what makes a person just or what makes a person good. He is going to say that a just person, a good person, builds others up, builds themselves up, and builds society up, and betters those things. And he's also going to end up saying that the just person doesn't have any enemies. Because the just person wants to improve themselves and improve everybody else. That's what it means to be just, is to improve and build things up, not tear them down, not get revenge, but to improve and build things up. And as I noted before, in his discussions of how to live a happy, fulfilling life and what an ideal city looks like, he's going to be using these images in an analogous way and comparing them to one another. So he's going to use the picture of the ideal society, what he calls a city, to illustrate what the ideal human character looks like. Just as the ideal society should be a class society with the knowledgeable people at the top, so, Plato thinks, the way that you should organize your life is that your knowledge and reason rules over the other parts of your body and mind. And that by prioritizing the good, prioritizing justice, that's going to allow you and society to be better off. Not letting your desires run rampant, not going from satisfying one desire to the next willy-nilly, but discipline and self-control and habituation into the proper ways of thinking, speaking, and acting. Because he thinks that people's characters and the character of society depends on one another. If you have an unjust society, that's going to produce unjust people. And if you have unjust people who are trying to build a society, they're going to build an unjust society. Okay? So for Plato, education and dialectic is going to be key. How do we build others up? Well, first, we give them the knowledge about what they're supposed to do. And then, once they have that knowledge, they can start utilizing it to better themselves and others. If we want to create a better society, we first need to improve the individuals of that society. Because if we don't, all of our utopianistic aims and goals are never going to be met. As long as the people are unjust, the society is going to be unjust, and vice versa. Does that make sense? Okay. So now let me just give you a brief summary of what is happening in this book and what is happening in these different chapters. And then we can kind of start getting into it and reading it ourselves. Of course, we'll start at the beginning. In the first book, and this is the one that we're going to start today, this is probably what we're going to be reading for the next few days. These different characters, Socrates, Glaucon, Adeimantus, Thrasymachus, Polemarchus, are having a dialogue about what justice is, how do we define justice, and why it's good. and the relationship between justice and the good life. Plato is going to end up saying that if you want to be a good person and if you want society to be good and just, the individuals in that society need to cultivate moderation, wisdom, and justice. And so the first book is concerned mainly with trying to figure out what justice is and how do we know that. Then later in the book, he's going to discuss, okay, it's kind of hard to talk about justice just within the human person. Let's kind of look at a society and see where justice and injustice shows up, so we can figure out where justice and injustice shows up in the individual and vice versa. We see him in this first book also hammering home this idea that the Homeric ideals on which Greek society is based are insufficient. They were good enough for a while, and there is wisdom in the old ways, in the old traditions, in the old worldviews. Say the worldviews of your parents or your parents' parents. There's wisdom and knowledge there, but those views are insufficient. Greek society, founded on ideals like physical prowess instead of training the mind, protection of your private interests over social interests, violent heroism in favor of conversation, and glory over self-betterment are bad. These things need to be done away with. People need to learn to start privileging different things, having different values and ideals, if Greek society is going to turn this ship around. Because if they keep going down the track that they're on, Plato thinks, it's just going to bring them more into ruin. Maybe they'll lose another war. Maybe more people will become corrupt. At worst, maybe society will devolve into a tyranny. And nobody wants that. We also see in these books this idea that society and the individuals in society mirror each other. So if you have lazy people in your society, society is going to be lazy. If you have mean individuals in your society is going to be mean. If you have violent, warlike individuals in your society is going to wage war on other nations and other peoples. Okay? So the character of society and the characters of individuals mirror each other. If you want to fix one, you have to fix the other. And Plato is trying to, in a sense, teach people how to be good with this book. This leads naturally into the idea that disorder in the individual leads to disorder in society. If the individuals don't have their shit together, then society is going to fall further into ruin and society won't have its shit together. Okay? And you can imagine why this might be true or how this is true. If everybody in society was the best person that they could be, helped out others, showed kindness and love, were patient and enduring and strong, we wouldn't have the social problems that we have, right? People would take care of each other. People would get their needs met. So, disorder in the individual produces disorder in society, which then produces disorder in the individuals that are being educated in that society, right? And so, in order to teach people or show people how to live a happy, healthy, just life, he says that we need to teach people to embody 3 primary virtues. Justice, which is going to be something like orderliness, proper orderliness. Moderation, courage, wisdom. Moderation in things, not being a glutton, not fasting all the time, not giving into too much wine, perhaps not drinking no wine, okay? Because, it might be a good thing to drink wine when you're at a party. Socially speaking, might be a good idea. But courage and wisdom also. One of the reasons why the Greeks are in the mess that they are in, Plato thinks, is because there is a lack of these virtues. Politicians are not courageous, right? They're kind of cowardly and they're in it for themselves. If they were courageous, they might take risks and help others and use their own wealth to help others, but a lot of them don't. But more important than these is wisdom. If you don't have wisdom, you don't know how to cultivate courage and moderation. You don't know what moderation is. You don't know what courage looks like. You don't know how to properly act these virtues out. So we can say that the most important of these three is going to be wisdom. Because you need wisdom in order to do the other stuff well. Make sense? Therefore, Plato is going to say, what the individuals in society need to do is they need to cultivate self-control and discipline and knowledge. Because if they don't do that, then they're not going to be able to become the best versions of themselves. And society is not going to be able to become its best version. Unless people learn to control their desires, control their instincts, discipline themselves, form good habits. And that the way that we do this primarily is through good education. If we want to get people to figure out how to live a good life, we have to educate them on that. And a lot of Greek education, Plato thinks, is lacking during this time. Students are not being taught the proper things. And you might say the same about our society today, right? The majority of people don't need calculus 1, right? Pre-algebra and algebra, sure, but we're not taught in school generally how to write and cash checks, bank policy, what a mortgage is. We're taught all of this stuff that we don't end up using later in life, right? And Plato thought something similar was happening during this time too. They weren't being taught the right things. And if you went to my school, the sexual education was even worse. Later on in the book, Plato is going to provide his outline for what the ideal society looks like, and therefore what the ideal human character looks like, and what we should model our character after if we want to be just, good, and happy. In Book 6, he presents this allegory of the cave, in which he describes people being trapped in this deep, dark cave who are constrained to look at the shadows on the cave wall that are being cast by people standing behind them with little puppets that they can't see. And the people in the cave think that the shadows are reality. That is all they know. They can't turn their necks and look around. All they see is the cave wall and these shadows dancing on the wall. And Plato likens this to kind of the natural state of humans without philosophy. The politicians, the unwise people in society, they think they know what society is like when really they only understand shadows. They don't actually grasp reality. And so the allegory goes, one of the prisoners manages to escape from the cave, comes out actually into the world and starts seeing things for the first time, water and reflections and the sun, finally comes to the truth. And with the truth, they are able to change themselves and change others. But within the allegory, there is also a warning. Because, like what happened to Socrates in the story, the prisoner goes back down into the cave to try to tell other people that they've seen the light, literally and figuratively, and the prisoners aren't having any of it, and they beat him to death. Make fun of him and beat him to death, just like what happened to Socrates. So he presents this allegory to try to explain why he thinks philosophy is important and how it should undergird Greek society moving forward. And then he provides what he thinks what the ideal society would look like. We can conceptualize this as an aristocratic epistocracy, a rule by the few people at the top who are wise and knowledgeable and understand how the world works. The knowledgeable people should be in power, Plato thinks. He calls them philosopher kings, but he says, yeah, women can be philosopher kings too, because we all have the capacity for reason. Okay? So we can all come to knowledge of the truth. These philosopher kings will be chosen by aptitude, by personality, and merit. Somebody who has a drive to learn, who has a love for knowledge, who shows good critical thinking skills, who does well in their studies, may become a philosopher king someday. But the people who don't care about that stuff, the people who just like carpentry or working in transactions and business, they won't become the philosopher kings. Plato actually is going to say later, I think, that whoever will become philosopher king will have to go through 50 years of education. And only then do they have the opportunity to become a ruler of the society, because that's how long it takes to understand this complex thing that we would call a city, how it runs and how it should be run. The philosopher kings will be the rulers who supposedly have knowledge of what reality is actually like, because they've been doing philosophy their whole life, engaging in critical thinking and logical argumentation their whole life. And because they have a drive to understand the world, because their logic and critical thinking skills are what is ruling over the other aspects of their bodies and minds, their desires and their emotions, ideally these people will have no lust for political power. They don't care about political power. In fact, one of the things that Socrates says later is building this ideal society would be very hard, because one of the things you have to do is convince the philosophers to be the rulers. And the philosophers don't want to be the rulers, okay? Because that's a lot of responsibility. Philosophers just want to think about stuff, okay? They don't want to be the rulers and have to manage people. So a big hurdle we're going to have to jump is, how do we convince the knowledgeable, wise people to actually take up the responsibility? And they're going to utilize dialectic to figure out how reality works. They're going to talk amongst themselves, and they will come together to make political decisions moving forward for the people. And so Plato lays out a three-tiered class society. Philosopher kings at the top, knowledgeable people. Then the spirited, poet, guardian, soldiers. And then the craftsmen, the tradesmen, the producers, and the builders on the bottom. Plato's going to go on to say that the philosopher kings and the policemen, the guardians, the policemen and the soldiers, will receive very little, if any, pay, and they will never be able to handle any money. That's how he gets around the problem of political corruption. He says the people who are producing things in society on the bottom, who are making the transactions, building the boats, building the chairs, building the cushions, whatever it is, almost all of the wealth that they produce is going to go back to them. And so those people will be able to live luxurious lives, but for the most part, the guardians and the philosopher kings will live relatively ascetic lives. They will not have material luxury. They will not even be allowed to really handle money. It's kind of an interesting idea, right? So this, I think, is a good general overview of what Plato is doing in this book. Obviously, this doesn't cover all of it. There's so much more. There's a lot of symbolism and rhetoric in the book that we have to talk about ourselves. But now we can transition to that. So what do you say? Should we start? Should we start reading this thing? Yeah, let's do it. All right. So everybody, pull your books out, or your laptops, whatever you have the book on, and open it up to the first page of book 1.
Not the preface, right?
Not the preface, no.
The preface, the prefix.
Open it up to the page that says book 1 at the top. I'm going to start because you would not believe how much is going on in just these first few sentences. Okay? If you read it yourself, you're not going to see much. But once I point out to you what Plato is doing, the profundity of this book is going to become clearer. Okay? So we start off with Socrates' narration. I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon. Okay, let's stop right there. Already, there's something very interesting symbolically happening in this book. When you think of knowledge symbolically, do you think high or low? You say high. What do you say?
High.
High. When you think ignorance, do you think high or low?
No.
Low, right? Already there is symbolism happening in the book. Socrates says, I went down to the Piraeus yesterday. So, what is this supposed to represent? It's supposed to represent the descent the philosopher has to engage in to communicate and interact among the people. The philosopher spends their time up in the clouds, in the eternal realm of truths and knowledge, up high, okay? And so, whenever you see going up or coming down, underline it in this book, because it's invoking the descent and the ascent of the person who is concerned with knowledge. Okay? High is supposed to represent light, the realm of truth, being in contemplation and thinking about things. Going down, or being low, is supposed to represent ignorance, darkness, being at the bottom of the cave that I talked about earlier, right? Or being with the people, interacting among the people. So I went down to the Piraeus yesterday with Glaucon, the son of Ariston, to say a prayer to the goddess. And also because I wanted to see how they would manage the festival, since they were holding it for the first time. Okay, so he's going down into the city. Socrates is going down into the city to interact amongst the people, to perform some religious rites, right? He says, I'm going down there to prepare, or to say a prayer to the goddess, and I'm going down to see this festival that the city is holding. Why do you think he's going down to the festival? In Greek, literally, Glaucon and Socrates are going to be theoria, which are called spectators of this festival. What could happen to them if they see this festival which is occurring for the first time? What happens when you see anything for the first time?
Gain new knowledge.
Right. Okay, so he's leaving the realm of contemplation and he's going down amongst the people, because even though the people aren't that knowledgeable, even though the people don't have all their ducks in a row, there's opportunity among the people to learn new things sometimes. Okay? So they're holding this festival for the first time. He says, I thought the procession of the local residents was beautiful, so the citizens of the city, but the show put on by the Thracians was no less so, in my view. The Thracians you can consider outsiders. Okay, they weren't born in Athens, they didn't grow up here. And he says, I thought both processions were beautiful. This is another aspect of Greek philosophy that is lost on you if you don't understand what they mean by beautiful. What do we mean by beautiful nowadays? When you say, oh yeah, I saw this beautiful girl the other day. What do we mean when we say that?
I think aesthetically pleasing.
Aesthetically pleasing, right? Pleasing to the eye. Tickles your senses or something, right? Beauty meant something different back then. Beauty literally meant revealing. To say something was beautiful during this time is to say it was revealing. It revealed something to you. And what does he say? I thought that the procession of the people from the city was revealing, but the show put on by the outsiders was no less revealing, in my view. So not only can we learn things, not only can we have new experiences by interacting with the familiar, with the known, we can also have new experiences and learn things by interacting with the strange, with the unfamiliar. Right? Because that's who the Thracians are to the citizens of Athens, right? They're strange. They're the stranger. They're the unfamiliar. Okay? After we had said our prayer and watched the procession, we started back toward town. Then, Polemarchus, remember this is supposed to be the guy who represents democracy in the dialogue. Polemarchus, the son of Cephalus, saw us from a distance as we were hurrying homeward, and told his slave boy to run and ask us to wait for him. The boy caught hold of my cloak from behind. The slave said, "Polemarchus wants you to wait." I turned around and asked where he was. "He's coming up behind you. Please wait for him." And then Glaucon butts in. "All right, we will." What do you think the significance is of Glaucon speaking here instead of Socrates? As you'll see throughout the dialogue, Glaucon is brave. He's going to rush into the arguments. He's going to rush into the battle. He's going to show strength and courage. But why do you think he's speaking here instead of Socrates? What do you think that represents?
Quite literally could be like the front guard situation of it. He also notably says we, as in a collective unit, rather than oh yeah, he'll wait here or I'll wait here. We.
Right. Glaucon is speaking for Socrates, isn't he?
Is it saying that Socrates is too good to talk to a slave?
That's not it. Socrates isn't going to be that snobby. We'll see him interacting in conversation with slaves later, if we ever get there in the book. But it's notable that Glaucon is speaking for Socrates here for a number of reasons. One, what happens in a democracy? What happens in a democracy when you have the majority rule, the people who rule and make the political decisions, compared to the kind of power and control over society that the smart people have? Democracy is ruled by the people, right?
So the majority of people are dumb. So
There's definitely that implication, yeah.
So even if they get what they want out of the society to a great effect versus the natural smart people actually what society.
Right. Yeah, so there are a few things that are happening. Glaucon speaks for both of them. And what that reveals to us symbolically is that insofar as Glaucon is not the intellectual equal of Socrates yet, an inferior person is speaking for the superior person here. Right? This is what happens in a democracy. The dumb, idiot people speak for everyone else. The smart people, right? The smart, wise people are few in number, so they don't have a lot of control over what happens in society. Whereas the masses, the demos, they end up speaking for the smart people. And that's ass backwards, right? Because in a democratic society, it's majority rule. And there's always going to be more dumb or average people than smart people, right? So here, not only do we have Plato kind of taking a dig at democracy, but he's showing what happens in a democracy, okay? The people who shouldn't have a say in how society is run end up having a say over the smart people. All right. Shortly after that, Polemarchus caught up with us. Adeimantus, Glaucon's brother, was with him, and so were Niceratus, the son of Nicias, and some others, all of whom were apparently on their way from the procession. Polemarchus then speaks up. It looks to me, Socrates, as if you two are hurrying to get away to town. Socrates says, that isn't a bad guess. But do you see how many we are? Certainly. Well, then either you must prove yourselves stronger than all these people, or you will have to stay here. What do you think is going on here? Literally, what's happening? What is Polemarchus saying to Socrates? They want to go away and do their philosophy, and Polemarchus says, no, you can't go away.
He's saying because there's more people that it's legalized with them because the majority makes the decision in a democracy.
And they're threatening the use of force. Right? They're saying, you're coming with us, buddy. You see how many of us there are? Go ahead, try taking us on. And Socrates is smart. He knows you can't take all these guys on. And he's getting up there in age. Okay, he's not as fit as he once was. So here we see another basic theme of the Republic explicated. Force versus persuasion in society. The ideal society is run by logic and reason and rational argumentation. But how is Greek society run? Through force. The masses, in a sense, forcing the rest of society to do what they want. Okay? So force wins out. Even though we should be engaging in persuasion and logic and critical thinking, in matters of practical affairs, force wins out. And that's not good. All right? That's a bad thing. So, what we get is this admission that, at least in Greek society, the wise, knowledgeable people do not have control. And again, we see this theme of power versus knowledge rearing its ugly head. Knowledge should be prioritized over political power and force, but that's not the way society is actually going right now. And what's happening in the dialogue is a direct representation of how Plato sees Greek society as being run. Is it time to go? 12:25? Okay. We'll pick up there on Tuesday. So I would say read about, you don't have to read the whole 30 pages, read 15 pages. Okay? Because we're not going to get through all 30.